Everyone keeps asking the same question about Iran. Who's going to control this? Will it be the United States with sanctions and aircraft carriers? Will it be regional powers trying to contain it? Will it be diplomacy, another nuclear deal, another framework, another round of negotiations? But what if that question is wrong from the start? What if this crisis isn't uncontrollable because leaders are incompetent, but because the structure itself resists control? And what if decades ago, Kuan explained exactly why crises like this spiral beyond anyone's command? Lee never governed in the Middle East. He built modern Singapore, a small state sitting at one of the world's most critical maritime choke points. But his worldview was not regional. It was structural. He believed geography is permanent, power flows through systems, and great powers get into trouble when they underestimate the forces embedded in the map. If you apply that lens to Iran, the so-called Iran crisis stops looking like a temporary diplomatic standoff. It starts looking like a structural storm. Iran sits at the center of one of the most strategically dense regions on Earth. To its south lies the Persian Gulf. To its north, the Caucasus and Central Asia. To its west, Iraq and the Levant. To its east, Afghanistan and Pakistan. And just off its coastline is the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow maritime corridor through which a massive share of global oil exports passes. That geography cannot be negotiated away. It cannot be sanctioned out of existence. It cannot be bombed into irrelevance. Lee understood choke points instinctively. Singapore sits near the Strait of Malacca, another global artery. Lee built his country around the idea that if you sit at a critical intersection, you don't escape geography, you harness it. Iran sits on a choke point too. But instead of embedding itself inside the Western-led global order, it positioned itself in resistance to it. That creates friction at the level of the global system. Every time tensions rise between the United States and Iran, energy markets react. Oil prices spike. Shipping insurance costs increase. Regional allies reposition militarily. Financial markets factor in instability. No missile has to launch. No invasion has to occur. The mere possibility changes global calculations. That's not diplomacy, that's structural leverage. The crisis nobody can control isn't just about uranium enrichment or ballistic missiles. It's about the fact that Iran's position gives it influence disproportionate to its GDP. Lee believed that power is not just about size, it's about position. Iran's position ensures that any escalation carries global consequences. That makes decisive military solutions unattractive. But it also makes ignoring the issue impossible. So the system oscillates. Sanctions are imposed, negotiations resume, talks collapse, tensions flare, limited strikes occur, back-channel diplomacy restarts, the cycle repeats. Why? Because each side faces structural constraints. For Washington, a full-scale war against Iran would risk regional conflagration. It could destabilize Iraq. It could inflame tensions with Israel and Gulf states. It could disrupt energy flows and trigger global economic shock. For Tehran, capitulating on its nuclear or regional ambitions could undermine domestic legitimacy and reduce its deterrent power in a hostile environment. Both sides are rational within their own frameworks, and that's exactly why the crisis persists. Lee often warned that great powers must recognize limits. Not every adversary can be reshaped. Not every regime can be pressured into compliance. Some conflicts become embedded in identity and geography. Iran is not simply a state pursuing power. It is a state with a revolutionary identity, forged in opposition to Western influence since 1979. That ideological layer hardens negotiation. Sanctions intended to coerce change often reinforce internal narratives of resistance. Military threats strengthen arguments for deterrence. External pressure becomes internal justification. The more pressure applied, the more adaptation occurs. Over decades of sanctions, Iran invested in asymmetric tools, missile capabilities, drone technology, regional proxy networks. It did not try to match the United States aircraft carrier for aircraft carrier. It designed a system of distributed leverage. If conflict breaks out directly, it can escalate regionally without engaging in conventional head-to-head battle. If diplomacy progresses, it can slow-roll concessions. If sanctions tighten, it can reroute trade, deepen relationships elsewhere, and adjust domestically. This is not chaos. It is systemic resilience. And systemic resilience makes crises durable. The United States deploys carrier strike groups to the Gulf to signal deterrence. Iran conducts military exercises to signal readiness. Each side calibrates its actions to avoid full-scale war while preserving credibility. That narrow corridor between escalation and restraint becomes the permanent operating zone. Lee believed that prolonged gray zone conflict drains strategic energy. It forces constant resource allocation without decisive outcomes. It ties up attention and military assets that could be focused elsewhere. Iran does not have to defeat the United States. It only has to remain unresolved. And remaining unresolved is surprisingly powerful. Every flare-up consumes diplomatic bandwidth. Every oil price surge reverberates domestically in the United States. Every proxy clash forces strategic recalibration. This is what makes the crisis feel uncontrollable, not because someone has lost command, but because no actor has total command. Iran cannot fully control how its regional proxies behave in every scenario. The United States cannot fully control how regional allies respond to perceived threats. Markets react to perception as much as reality. Multiple feedback loops interact simultaneously. Energy flows influence global inflation. Inflation influences domestic politics. Domestic politics influences foreign policy decisions. Foreign policy decisions influence regional actors. Regional actors influence Iran's calculations. Iran's calculations influence energy markets again. The cycle reinforces itself. Kuan believed that when systems become deeply interconnected, small disturbances can trigger disproportionate consequences. Choke points amplify tension, identity amplifies rigidity, geography amplifies stakes. The Iran crisis contains all three: a choke point in the Strait of Hormuz, a rigid ideological divide between Tehran and Washington, a region dense with fragile states and competing powers. Add nuclear capability into that mix, and the stakes rise further. Iran's nuclear program serves multiple purposes. It offers potential deterrence. It offers bargaining leverage. It offers domestic prestige. For the United States and its allies, it represents proliferation risk and regional destabilization. Neither side can easily abandon its core position, so negotiations produce partial frameworks, interim understandings, temporary freezes. But the underlying strategic logic remains intact. Lee would have recognized the pattern immediately. When the fundamental incentives driving a conflict remain unchanged, agreements become pauses, not resolutions. And that is why the Iran crisis feels like a movie stuck on loop. Escalation, de-escalation, talks, breakdown, sanctions, countermeasures, repeat. What makes it especially difficult to control is that the crisis is not bilateral. It involves regional actors with their own agendas, Gulf states balancing deterrence and economic stability, Israel calculating its own red lines, European powers trying to prevent nuclear escalation, major powers outside the region observing carefully. The crisis is a network, and networks resist centralized control. Lee believed that stability in geopolitics depends on clarity, clear deterrence lines, clear alliances, clear economic structures. The Middle East offers the opposite: overlapping alliances, proxy conflicts, fragile states, and shifting red lines. In that environment, even well-intentioned moves can misfire. A limited strike intended as deterrence can provoke broader escalation. A sanction intended as pressure can entrench resistance. A diplomatic gesture intended to calm tensions can be interpreted as weakness. Control becomes illusion. Management becomes the only option. And management requires constant vigilance. That is exhausting for any great power. The United States must maintain naval presence in the Gulf. It must coordinate with regional allies. It must monitor nuclear developments. It must calibrate sanctions carefully to avoid unintended humanitarian fallout, all while managing global competition elsewhere. Iran, meanwhile, must balance domestic economic strain, internal political pressures, regional ambitions, and external threats. Both operate under constraint. Neither possesses full freedom of maneuver. That mutual constraint is the defining feature of the crisis. Kuan believed that when two adversaries are locked into mutual deterrence without mutual trust, they create a stable instability. Stable because neither wants total war. Unstable because friction never disappears. That is Iran today. The crisis nobody can control is not a countdown to war. It is a permanent strategic condition. It is geography asserting itself. It is ideology hardening positions. It is energy flows tying regional conflict to global consequences. It is nuclear capability raising stakes just high enough to prevent decisive action. And it is a network of regional actors adding layers of unpredictability. Lee's worldview suggests that the only true control in such situations comes from disciplined prioritization, knowing which escalations to ignore, which provocations to absorb, which negotiations to pursue, and which red lines to enforce clearly. But even discipline cannot eliminate the underlying structure. Iran sits where it sits. The Strait of Hormuz will remain vital. Regional rivalries will persist. Identity narratives will not dissolve overnight. So the crisis endures, not because no one is trying to solve it, but because the forces sustaining it are deeper than any single policy. Kuan once argued that great powers fail when they mistake symptoms for causes. The Iran crisis is often framed as a nuclear problem, or a sanctions problem, or a regime problem. But beneath all of those lies a structural reality, a strategically positioned state with enough capability to resist, enough leverage to disrupt, and enough identity to endure. That combination makes clean solutions impossible. The crisis nobody can control is not spiraling because of chaos. It persists because of structure. And structure, once embedded in geography and identity, is extraordinarily difficult to dismantle. That is the uncomfortable truth, not about incompetence, not about weakness, but about limits, even for superpowers. And once you understand that, the question changes. Not how to control the crisis, but how to live with it without letting it define your future.